All right, Heather Klein is going to introduce our next panelist. And Heather is the lead curator here at Great Creek Mound Archaeological Complex, and she's been a friend to all this week and really helped us learn a lot as we volunteer.
I am really excited. I'm really excited to have our next speaker come up and talk. I was lucky enough to be one of her first students in the first course that she ever taught at the College of William & Mary, and that was in the spring of 2000. But Dr. Ywone Edwards-Ingram is a staff archaeologist and coordinator of the African American Archaeology part of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation in Williamsburg, Virginia. She is also a part-time faculty member at the College of William & Mary and is the author of numerous published articles pertaining to African American material culture and heritage. She is originally from Jamaica, and she received her undergraduate degree from the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica. She came to Williamsburg, Virginia to earn her master's and doctorate degrees from the College of William & Mary with a specialization in material culture and African American studies. Ywone is married with 2 children, and her husband is actually an interpreter and Baptist preacher for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. And today, she'll be talking to us about how data that has been recovered from archaeological sites with African American components is used to discuss cultural practices relating to locally made items, imported things, the landscape, and the use of animals for foods and medicines. Archaeological resources are vital to ongoing efforts to visualize and to make known the tangibles and intangibles of African American heritage in public representations and commemorations of the past. So please help me welcome Dr. Ywone Edwards-Ingram.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. Americans often turn to the past to explain current social conditions, to comfort themselves, to build self-esteem, and to create cultural pride. What aspects of the past are remembered and how they are remembered and interpreted are important issues that allow us to see how public memory develops. Today, we're here part of an activity to create memory, and it's a purposeful event. In other words, we made a conscious decision to be here today, and I'm very happy that you're including me as part of this memory-making project. Today, I'll be talking to you about how to see. We do a lot of looking, but we also sometimes need a little help to see things. So it's my task today, and I hope I'm getting this right, to help to guide you. I see myself as a research fellow or researcher who have learned so much from other researchers. So at the same time, I'm standing behind researchers, I'm also leading. And at the same time, I'm standing beside them. So it's a back and forth beside project or beside process, because I'm not the only one doing this. As you see today, there are many people who are involved in this field, and I'm very happy too that Kim McBride, she has pointed out some of the things that I will be talking to you about today. But remember, repetition is never the same thing, so I'll be building on it a little, and she has laid the groundwork. And what I'll do today is to show you some of the interpretation that can be derived from taking things a little bit further. And I have worked with many different scholars in history, material culture, archaeology. And archaeology is a teamwork effort, but sometimes you can go off on a little limb and do some interpretation by yourself. So that's a disclaimer. My disclaimer is not many people say things that I do and may not go as far as I do. but I do so standing on the shoulder, as I said, of many, many interpreters, researchers, and scholars. Now, I've taught a course at William & Mary called Museum and Slavery for many, many years, and one of the big questions that we try to answer based on the topic that one very important English historian, James Walvin, quite a chatty little fellow, I would say, and he asked this big question: what should we do about slavery? And that's a question that we try to address. Slavery, I should say, is not the defining factor of African American history. There are other areas of African American history, but today I'll be focusing on slavery because that's one of the main areas that I study. Now, the center gentleman that you see there, and I also tend to go a little British myself, being from Jamaica, so I say gentleman is my better half, who does the interpretation of a Baptist preacher, an 18th century Baptist preacher. He's also an ordained minister, so I do live with the past. I do live with interpretation. I do live with the material culture of a colonial era as part of my everyday existence. So in trying to talk about 18th century history and archaeology, I do like to talk about diversity. I'm talking about a particular group of people, but they were not just standing by themselves. They were a part of network, part of connection, part of a social world where different groups were involved. So they're not just living and producing evidence about their world by themselves. I'm not saying it's a cooperative world or it's the world that they made together or the world they made in spite of their differences. So it's more like concentrating on differences and people having different agenda, but somehow it came together to produce what we call our cultural heritage, the landscape, the objects that are left behind. So in looking at these objects, the recreation of the landscape, how we define our past, how we do reinterpret things, and how we are getting just a glimpse of what really happened. So most history is an interpretation. It's going to be an interpretation of the past. So what do we bring to that interpretation, and what is our agenda? If you think of most scholarship can be divided into stages, or it could be sections, or some would just stop at one section or another. If you think about one aspect of the work we do, we document. So it's mostly documentary. But at another level, we interpret. We like to find out about significance. We like to find out about meaning, what means these things. And we also move to another level where we do have this big agenda, civics agenda. So we want to change lives. We want to change thoughts. We want to let people have a different view. We want to feel comfortable about ourselves. And also we want to learn from the past. That's one of the big motto. The place that I work, Colonial Williamsburg, very big 18th century town, recreated town, village, living museum. And the motto is that the future may learn from the past. So we want to make sure that we learn from history and not repeat some of our mistakes. And we also want to do things that we do well to continue doing so. Because all what we do is part of a journey. We're trying to understand ourselves, our human conditions, and also to know that people in the past, they did things very similar like we do. They had similar concerns, but still they had very different conditions, different circumstances. So we're going to be finding that some of the objects that we find from sites are very similar because they are part of that material world, what was available at that time. So you are going to be able to use what is in your world as best as you can. Sometimes you can be constrained by your social status or your social condition. So even though we talk about lifestyle of enslaved people, there are groups of researchers who said, no, you cannot talk about lifestyle. You can only have a lifestyle if you have control over it or you can determine that lifestyle. But so you have life ways. So you have these little picky titles that people will use. For example, when we do oral history, some people want to say, you have an informant, and other people, no, you have an interviewee. So there are these little terms. But we have to think about terms because they are very important in the way we look at different interpretation of the past. Now I'm going to go do a quick brief through of a number of topics, and I'll be talking about creativity, family and community, religion and ritual. You've heard a little bit about rituals and religion in Kim's talk, and foodways that has been part of coming and going in different interpretations and delivery today. Dress and adornment, very much part of what has been discussed today. Work, remember slavery was work. Health and well-being, very important. We want to have a well-lived life. We have different definition of what is a well-lived life and what we need, what type of comfort we need to achieve that. Health and well-being, very important. Housing, that's where we try to have family unit or to have shelter, or very important for archaeologists because it helps us to understand domestic life. Now, the group that I'm talking about, many did not voluntarily came to the U.S. or to the American colonies. They were actually forced migration to the Americas, and the period that I'm looking at it, anytime from the 15th to the 19th century. And this is a group of Africans who came very much from Africa in different numbers over many years, and they came on a different condition. Most of the islanders being on the Middle Passage, the nature of the journey, what was retained, where they came from, which section of Africa was more important. For Virginians, there's much focus on West Central Africa, and there's this aspect that was going to be important when we talk about rituals, that there are a particular group of Africans that were very influential in terms of worldview and approach to the natural world and the supernatural world. And that the beliefs of those people, the Bakongo people, have influenced archaeological thinking for a while. Now, in whatever we do, we need to seek balance, and we always want to understand what from our past influence our future. So to understand African American life, we want to talk about where they came from, Africa, but we want to have an understanding that they did not take up a cultural baggage or pack a suitcase and came here. And also that all cultures will change. So within changing cultures, meeting new people, interacting with people, new cultural forms will develop. Now, how do you present African American culture? If you go too much on the African side, you underestimate the creativity of Africans in the New World. If you discard the African side, then you're thinking there is no evidence of survival or cultural remembrance or parallel. So it's a balancing act, as I would say. Now, as I mentioned, different groups do things in similar way, and we heard a lot about Native American approaches too, and the use of different objects and even birds and representation of forms. And we see where life is very important. The cycle of life, because we all born, then go through apex at noon where we reach the peak of our existence, and then we start descending. So there's different representation, and sometimes you see that represented as a cross mark, representing the moments of the sun, where you go from that awakening till you go back to another world of the dead, or the ancestors. So that's depicted by different people in different forms. Now, this is one example of a cross mark on a clay pipe. This clay pipe, locally made Chesapeake pipe, very much from the 17th century era. And that has been seen to be that's clay pipes, white clay pipes, locally made Chesapeake pipes. They're very much part of a debate who made them or how they were used. And there is some consensus that some of the decorations on the pipes were actually African-based. But Native Americans have made these pipes for years, so at some level, there's this movement from not so much who made them, but who actually used them. The same thing could be said about courseware called colonial wear, where you have, and I cannot even say that Native American made pottery because I've seen so many pottery shards since I came to this Grave Creek Mound, and I'm very pleased that we do have that heritage and it's being preserved. So we do have, it's given right now, no doubt, that we have Native American making pottery. For African American, the enslaved people, it's very difficult to prove. You have to have like broken shards, broken pottery fragments showing the manufacturing, actual site of manufacturing. Like fired pieces that were not totally fired, or if you can find evidence of other types of objects being made at that site, like clay marbles. So it's very difficult to pinpoint that they actually made these ware, but we do know that Native Americans made these ware. But to another level too is we are interested in the marks, decoration, and the type of wares that are associated with colonial ware. They're not very decorative. They are more or less plain ware, and they are in different forms, but they do show the influence of Native Americans and European mixed together. I want to move quickly to talk about some of the sites that help to influence our idea of how slaves live and work. And this is Carter's Grove. I'll be mentioning 3 sites quickly: Carter's Grove, Rich Neck, and Great Oaks Plantation. 2 sites, the Carter's Grove and the Rich Neck Plantation, they are sites that were excavated. The Great Oaks Plantation, we made it up ourselves. So after a while, you've done enough excavation, you can move into interpretation. So this is a site that was excavated in the 1970s, and one signature item, signature foundation, or archaeological feature that's always seems to be present in slave sites are root cellars. You've seen a few examples of those before, and the objects that came from these root cellars at Carter's Grove were very interesting in terms of they were complete objects. For example, there's a spoon, a pewter spoon that was never used, because on the back of the spoon there's a section that's called a rat tail, and there were actually no wear marks on the spoons. So you think about slaves being living a life in many ways deprived of many social things, social material goods and so on, but being able to have a number of objects that are still intact. You also see a range of goods. You're going to see things related to work, things related to clothing, decorations, dressing the body, and things like a mirror, which was considered a very expensive item. Keys, you can talk about whether there were items enough to be locked away. There are things related to food waste, but also you have to consider where things were stored, because for slave cabins, they were not living there by themselves. It's always of groups of related and unrelated people. But later on, as the 18th century progressed, you do have more family style lodging than just people who were unrelated. So for places like slave quarters, they are the type of sites that you can learn more about slave life than, for example, an in-town dwelling, because these are discrete areas where slaves were actually living by themselves. It's not as mixed component sites, say, for example, when you go into an urban area. So from the material goods, we can move into interpretation. What was actually done with these objects? How were they used? Did they just serve as just food waste? And when we talk about food waste, are we talking about food for just human consumption, or we're talking about foods for the gods? Because there are many different cultures who do make food offering to different deities or to different gods. So we can also think about food as medicine, because in looking at medicinal practices, we do look at plants remains, we do look at animal remains that are used for food. But you can look at plants that serve in both spheres. For example, corn, that was also used for medicine, but it was grown for food. So there's a thin line or thin division between things that were used for food as well as medicine, because what goes in the body is also good for medicine and for health reasons. Now, we're having technical difficulty, but we're fine.
Don't mind us.
Yeah. Most of the things that we find on sites are related to the process of either trying to get things or the side of production. For example, how do you get your grocery? So it's trying to get to that food source, and then later on you're going to have to prepare that food for consumption. So you move from the trying to get that food to move to preparing the food, and then later on you're going to consume that food. And then you get to the end product where we have the animal bones from that food remains. So we are always trying to recover different aspects of the lifestyle or the lifeways of an individual or a group of people. And most of what we are going to find in archaeology is not going to be the total lifeways. It's just going to be glimpses, because not everything is going to be preserved. We do talk about the historical document as being a little biased, but the archaeology too has its own biases in terms of what can be saved or what is actually saved or what you can use to interpret. I think for most of the interpretation, we try to answer questions about the wearing of different things like beads and shells. Some of the shells that we find in archaeological sites are like cowrie shells, and cowrie shells were used in Africa for ritual purposes as well as for decoration. So when you're adorning the body, it can be for both purposes. You can be adorning for protection as well as for aesthetic and just decoration. I mean, I could tell you that any jewelry that I'm wearing today is part of a protection as well as adornment. So sometimes things are not mutually exclusive. So we also think about shells, which was very much part of decorating the body, and how these things also serve in many other areas. Because most of the time we're looking at objects, they have different lifeways, life cycle. So we have to think about their primary uses as well as their secondary uses, and it could be other uses too. So at what time were these things that they had actually served as, for example, oyster shell? One of my favorite objects is actually oyster shell. There is a very interesting reading that said making dead oysters talk. So it's trying to make dead oyster shell talk. So I like to use oyster shell as an example to talk about the different ways you can look at an object. You can think about oyster shell as related to food. You can also think about it can be used as some sort of a ashtray for, like, if you're having tobacco smoke and you want tobacco ashes and want to put it in there. But you can also think about the shell as used for pavement, paving the yards, and it was also a very important source for the shell. The crushed shell could be used as inclusion as a binding agent in making pottery. So you see these shell-tempered ware. And I usually talk a lot about oyster shells, and sometimes I really forget to talk about it as food. But you can think of the oyster shell too for African American culture as grave decoration. Graves are very important places for African American culture and people within the African diaspora, because it's a site for enacting rituals. You could use grave dirt for different medicinal purposes, and also you can think about gravesite and funeral as very purposeful action. In fact, for burials, and that would go for burial mounds too, those were intentionally placed goods. When you find things in burials, you do know that those were intentionally placed there. Most of the objects that you find around slave sites or around slave quarters, they are discarded, lost objects, or things that were out there being beaten in the sun and really exposed to the weather. But things that are inside a grave, it's easier to interpret those because more or less they are related to the act of burial or to some belief system about the afterlife. Graves also too are, you can talk about a social unit of a group because it's almost always a community or a communal effort in burying the dead. So these are very interesting sites, and without my slides, I'm not sure. So I might actually ask you to ask me some questions, but I want to emphasize in learning about the past is to always remember it's about us too, and it's also very similar to our foreign country. So we're always on a journey, a quest to know who we are, and we're always at different stages of the journey. So it's going to be a lot of meandering and a false turn, but we just still have to keep progressing and keep trying to get to a place where we can understand ourselves better. Now, I'd like to end right now to tell you that there's this famous Frederick Douglass, always, once he was asked how he did what he did and how he had success in trying to influence people, and he would say, okay, I agitate. And if you want to get something done or to be somewhere, you should agitate. So I want to encourage you to keep agitating, keep pushing for better interpretation, better study, more preservation for the historic item, more preservation for archaeology things, and to remember archaeology is not just the study of one darn thing after another. It's about trying to understand past life ways and to understand ourselves. And before you start to agitate for me to get down, I will end. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. We won't agitate, but I think our computer agitated a little bit. Who knows? There had been some sort of virus. We got it to come up, but it wouldn't project. So we're going to work on that. We'll have things ready after lunch for your presentation, Rebecca Morehouse. Any questions for Dr. Edwards-Ingram about her presentation? I think, okay.
Is there a commonality in burying the dead in West Africans?
No, I would not say there's a commonality because each cultural group is going to have differences, but there are certain idea of like burying with burial goods, with grave goods, that could be found, or for some areas, east-west burial, or places that you should not bury your dead. There are certain here you could bury within the house compound, so I would not say that there are clear-cut similarity, but we cannot just go out and say, this is a prescription, do it like that way.
But generally they were buried without being cremated.
That I'm not sure, because if they're cremated, we archaeologists will never find the bones, so we are not sure about cremation. That might be more from the historical sources.
Okay, another question over here.
In your work, have you ever explored comparing and contrasting the similarities seen with different Native American tribes and the African slaves that came over because of their contact together?
Yes, for a while I tried to look at when the African met the Indians, sort of playing after when Harry met Sally, not as dramatic as that. And I do see similarity in terms of, for example, the practice of having the baby on the back. As you can see that in African culture, very much having your child wherever you're working. There's also some similarity with women being very much part of our culture, and men being the auntie and the gathering. No, women gather too, but men being the one who hunt, and the women would be more considered doing the gardening practices. So there are some similarities. And medicinal practices, I think that's a wide area to look for similarity. Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Run up here, okay? This is Travis Henline, who's the site manager for Independence Hall, also part of the West Virginia Division of Culture and History, and someone who has taught for us in Native American Studies in a couple of different capacities. So I want to introduce him and thank him for being here today and embarrass him.
I just wondered, you do the archaeological research and the documentary research, but how does that research translate into what the visitor to Colonial Williamsburg the information they will receive? Because I know there can often be challenges with that, and there's a lot involved in that, and taking what you learn from the archaeology and documents and translating it to the people who actually come and visit.
I see the strongest way to do that is in the decoration of a place or a space. In other words, if you can translate that into a visual display, a way of showing that these are the objects that slaves usually use, this is where they slept, this is how they live. Because, for example, in a town like Colonial Williamsburg, they're not in the historic area, the main historic area itself, there's not a slave quarter that is built for, or restored, or reconstructed for slaves. So the material things for the slaves would more or less be very similar to what is in the bakehouse. So there's the nuance in doing this now. What you have to do is to move away from ownership to talk about access. So people have access to things, and for example, many of the things that are in the big house or part of the elite or the white population, they did not use it. Those things were actually used by the enslaved people. You know, we do get that Martha Washington or different people actually went into the kitchen and they cook and so on, and the wife did so and so, but it's really the slaves who did these things, so you do that. Okay.
If you want to point out a couple of things that you didn't get to touch on in your talk.
Well, you did talk about how do you move from archaeology into decorating an interpretive space. So you see, am I clicking? Most of the evidence for the above grounds, the above area for structure is not going to be in archaeology. So you're working with the footprints. So what can you do with that footprint? You have to find archaeological evidence to help you, historical evidence to enlarge on that, the upper structure to exactly the rest of the chimney. You just seen the foundation. But there are examples of standing slave quarters that could help you to understand how to reconstruct. But for some of the evidence that even get into the archaeology, into the reconstructions, are not from archaeology. So because some of the things are not, they would not survive, like a wooden bowl or gourd stuff. You see, for example, benches, wooden benches, those would not survive. So there's a lot of reliance on the historical record because we're in the historic period. And some areas are better described in the historical record. We do talk about not having enough historical record, but we do have a lot of the historical record that will help us. You saw that scissors from the earlier excavation, so that helped to help to put the scissors in that slave quarter. When you find European wares, you can also include those. At Carter's Grove, there were fragments of metal pots, so you can move from that. So sometimes it's not a one-to-one correlation, but once you have evidence. And if you do not have that evidence from Carter's Grove, but someone else excavated an 18th century site within the same period, it's a plantation, you can move from that evidence to the interpretation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and we're sorry for the technical problem there with the slideshow. Not sure what happened, but we'll get on it. So it's now time for our Symposium Luncheon, and that's going to be taking place upstairs. So when you exit these doors, you just sort of make a U-turn and head up the steps. If you have trouble with stairs, there is a ramp that just goes outside the building and comes in on the second floor. Look for some of our volunteers with these lanyard name tags. And I'll see you all back here by 1 o'clock. Thank you.